Meet Ethan Carter, a sharp-witted real estate lawyer with a penchant for minimalist living and a deep-seated hatred for unnecessary rules. Ethan wasn't your typical suit-and-tie attorney. Sure, he could argue a case with the best of them, but his true passion lay in the world of tiny homes. It all started one lazy Sunday afternoon when Ethan stumbled upon a YouTube video titled, "Living Large in 200 Square Feet." Intrigued, he clicked. 2 hours and 20 tiny home tours later, Ethan was hooked. He dreamed of a life where his biggest worry would be whether his compost bin was too close to his solar panels. So, when Ethan finally saved enough to buy his own house, he didn't just buy any house. He bought a cozy bungalow in the heart of Maplewood Estates, a suburban neighborhood known for its perfectly manicured lawns, identical beige houses, and a homeowners association, HOA, that had more rules than a medieval kingdom. The HOA, led by the formidable Margaret Whitmore, was infamous for its nitpicky regulations. Want to paint your front door a different color? Fill out a form and wait 6 weeks for approval. Thinking about planting a rose bush? Better make sure it's the right shade of red. And don't even get them started on holiday decorations. Anything larger than a garden gnome required a perm. But Ethan wasn't deterred. He had a vision, a tiny home in his backyard. It would be his sanctuary, his escape from the chaos of his legal career. He imagined mornings spent sipping coffee on a tiny porch, afternoons tinkering with his tiny garden, and evenings curled up with a book in his tiny living room. It was going to be perfect. He shared his plans with his friends over beers one Friday night. A tiny home? Like, for humans? His best friend, Mike, asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, for humans, Ethan replied, rolling his eyes. It's going to be amazing. Affordable, sustainable, and just cozy. But what about the HOA? Mike asked, his voice dripping with concern. You know, they're basically the Gestapo of suburbia. Ethan waved his hand dismissively. Please, I'm a lawyer. If anyone can outmaneuver the HOA, it's me. And so, with the confidence of someone who had once won a case because the opposing attorney misspelled plaintiff, Ethan began his tiny home journey. He sketched out plans, researched eco-friendly materials, and even joined a Facebook group called Tiny Home Enthusiasts Who Hate HOAs. His backyard was the perfect spot. Just enough space for a 200-square-foot tiny home without encroaching on his neighbor's prized hydrangeas. He imagined the finished product. A sleek, modern structure with large windows, a lofted bed, and a composting toilet, because why not? Ethan's excitement was palpable. He started referring to his tiny home as the Dream Pod, and even created a Pinterest board titled, Tiny Home, Big Life. He told everyone who would listen about his plans, from his mailman to the barista at his favorite coffee shop. It's going to be so sustainable, he gushed to the barista, who nodded politely while steaming his oat milk latte. I'll have solar panels, a rainwater collection system, and maybe even a tiny chicken coop. The barista blinked. Chickens? In Maplewood Estates? Ethan shrugged. Why not? If the HOA can tell me what color my curtains should be, I can tell them I'm starting a microfarm. But as Ethan's excitement grew, so did his naivety. He had forgotten one crucial detail. The HOA didn't just enforce rules, they lived for them. One sunny afternoon, Ethan received a letter in the mail. It was printed on crisp, official-looking paper and signed by none other than Margaret Whitmore herself. The subject line read, Notice of Violation, Unapproved Structure. Ethan's heart sank as he read the letter. According to the HOA, his tiny home was a blight on the community's aesthetic and a potential hazard to property values. They demanded he cease all construction immediately or face legal action. He stared at the letter, his jaw clenched. A blight? Really? My tiny home is going to be adorable. But the HOA wasn't done. They scheduled a meeting to discuss his violation, and Ethan knew he had to prepare. He spent hours poring over the HOA's bylaws, highlighting every vague clause and ambiguous phrase. As he worked, a fire ignited in his chest. This wasn't just about a tiny home anymore, it was about principle. The HOA had picked the wrong lawyer to mess with. All right, Margaret, Ethan muttered, sipping his third cup of coffee. "You want to play hardball? Let's play." Ethan Carter was no stranger to adversity. He'd faced down aggressive opposing counsel, survived all-nighters during law school, and even managed to assemble IKEA furniture without crying. But nothing could have prepared him for the sheer absurdity of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. The HOA's letter was just the beginning. A few days later, Ethan received a summons to attend a special meeting to discuss his unapproved structure. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. sharp at the community clubhouse, a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought beige was a personality trait. Ethan arrived early, armed with a folder full of research, a thermos of coffee, and a determination that could only come from someone who had once argued a case while running on 2 hours of sleep and a stale bagel. He took a seat at the front of the room, directly across from Margaret Whitmore, the HOA president. Margaret was exactly what you'd expect from a woman who voluntarily took on the role of neighborhood dictator. She was in her late 50s, with a perfectly coiffed bob of silver hair and a penchant for pastel-colored blazers that screamed, "I take myself way too seriously." She sat at the head of the table, flanked by a group of equally stern-looking HOA board members, all of whom seemed to have mastered the art of looking simultaneously bored and judgmental. "Mr. Carter," Margaret began, her voice dripping with faux politeness, "thank you for joining us. We're here to discuss your project." Ethan smiled sweetly. "You mean my tiny home?" "Yes. I'm so excited about it. It's going to be a sustainable, eco-friendly space that—" Margaret held up a hand, cutting him off. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The fact is, your tiny home," she said the words like they left a bad taste in her mouth, "violates several of our community guidelines." She slid a stack of papers across the table. Ethan glanced at them. It was a list of HOA bylaws, each one highlighted in neon pink. According to Section 12.3, Margaret continued, adjusting her glasses, "all structures must be approved by the HOA prior to construction." And Section 14.7 clearly states that no structure may exceed 150 square feet without special permission. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "My tiny home is 200 square feet, but it's not a structure. It's a premium multifunctional room. It's for work, relaxation, and, yoga." Margaret smirked. "Semantics won't save you, Mr. Carter. The HOA has a responsibility to maintain the aesthetic integrity of this community." "Your tiny home," she said it again, this time with extra disdain, "does not meet our standards." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And what exactly are your standards, Margaret?" "Beige walls and a crippling fear of individuality." The room fell silent. One of the board members choked on their coffee. Margaret's face turned a shade of red that clashed horribly with her pastel blazer. "This isn't a joke, Mr. Carter," she snapped. "If you proceed with this project, we will have no choice but to take legal action." Ethan leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Legal action, huh? Well, I guess it's a good thing I'm a lawyer." The room erupted into murmurs. Margaret looked like she'd just been told her favorite rulebook had been banned. "Be that as it may," she said, recovering quickly. "The HOA's bylaws are clear, and unless you can provide a compelling reason why we should make an exception for your shed, we have no choice but to enforce them." Ethan stood up, his folder clutched tightly in his hands. "Oh, I'll provide a reason, Margaret. In fact, I'll provide several. But first, I'd like to remind you that the HOA's bylaws are not the 10 Commandments. They're a set of guidelines, open to interpretation. And as a lawyer, I happen to be very good at interpreting." He opened his folder and began laying out his case. He cited obscure clauses, pointed out inconsistencies in the bylaws, and even referenced a 1983 court case involving a man who successfully sued his HOA for the right to keep a life-size statue of Bigfoot in his front yard. By the time he was done, the board members looked thoroughly confused, and Margaret's face had progressed from red to a concerning shade of purple. "In conclusion," Ethan said, snapping his folder shut, "my tiny home is not a violation of your bylaws. It's a premium multifunctional room that enhances the value and sustainability of this community. And if you try to stop me, I'll see you in court." The room was silent for a moment. Then one of the board members, a man with a mustache so thin it looked like it had been drawn on with a pencil, cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "this is unexpected." Margaret glared at him, then turned back to Ethan. "This isn't over, Mr. Carter. The HOA will not be bullied." Ethan smiled. "Neither will I, Margaret. Neither will I." As he left the clubhouse, Ethan couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. Ethan Carter was not one to back down from a challenge. If anything, the HOA's resistance only fueled his determination. He spent the next week buried in legal texts, HOA bylaws, and an alarming number of coffee cups. His tiny home wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a mission, and missions required strategy. His first step was to dig deeper into the HOA's bylaws. He figured if he was going to outsmart Margaret Whitmore and her pastel blazer-wearing minions, he needed to know their rules better than they did. So, he printed out the entire 47-page document and began annotating it like a mad scientist. By day 3, his living room looked like the set of a conspiracy theory documentary. Papers were strewn across every surface, sticky notes covered the walls, and a whiteboard in the corner was filled with phrases like Section 12.3, Loophole, and Margaret Whitmore, Enemy of Joy. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that Ethan struck gold. Buried deep within the bylaws in a section titled Miscellaneous Provisions, he found it. A single sentence that would change everything. Structures under 200 square feet that are classified as non-permanent, multifunctional spaces do not require HOA approval. Ethan stared at the sentence, his eyes wide. Non-permanent, multifunctional spaces, he muttered. That's it. That's my loophole. He immediately got to work reclassifying his tiny home. It was no longer a tiny home. It was a premium multifunctional room. He drafted a detailed document outlining its intended uses. A home office, a yoga studio, a reading nook, and, in case the HOA asked, a meditation space for emotional well-being. But Ethan didn't stop there. He knew Margaret Whitmore wouldn't go down without a fight, so he decided to stack the deck in his favor. He reached out to a contractor who specialized in modular, non-permanent structures and had him design his tiny home to be technically movable. It would sit on a trailer base, making it non-permanent by definition. "Take that, Margaret," Ethan said, admiring the blueprints. With his legal argument and construction plans in place, Ethan scheduled a follow-up meeting with the HOA. He arrived at the clubhouse armed with his folder of evidence, a confident smile, and a tiny home-shaped pin on his lapel that he'd bought just for the occasion. Margaret, of course, was ready for him. She sat at the head of the table, flanked by the same board members who had looked so confused at the last meeting. This time, however, they seemed more prepared, or at least they had more coffee. "Mr. Carter," Margaret began, her tone dripping with condescension, "I see you've returned. I hope you've come to your senses and decided to abandon this project of yours." Ethan smiled sweetly. "Actually, Margaret, I've come to enlighten you." He handed out copies of his document, complete with highlighted bylaws and a diagram of his tiny home labeled Premium Multifunctional Room. "As you can see," he began, "my structure is under 200 square feet and is classified as a non-permanent, multifunctional space. According to Section 19.2 of the bylaws, such structures do not require HOA approval." Margaret's face twitched. She glanced at the document, then at the board members, who were flipping through their copies with varying degrees of confusion. "This is highly irregular," she said, her voice tight. "Irregular, but legal," Ethan replied. "And as a lawyer, I can assure you that my interpretation of the bylaws is sound. In fact, I'd be happy to take this to court if you'd like a second opinion." The room fell silent. One of the board members, a man with a mustache so thin it looked like it had been drawn on with a pencil, cleared his throat. "Well," he said hesitantly, "if the bylaws allow it." Margaret shot him a glare that could melt steel. "The bylaws are open to interpretation," she said through gritted teeth. "And it is the HOA's duty to ensure that all structures align with the community's aesthetic standards." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. And what exactly is the community's aesthetic standard, Margaret? Beige walls and a crippling fear of creativity? Because last I checked, my tiny home, my premium multifunctional room, is both functional and visually appealing. In fact, I'd argue it enhances the community's aesthetic by adding a touch of innovation. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan cut her off. And let's not forget, he added, that my structure is eco-friendly. Solar panels, rainwater collection, sustainable materials. It's everything a forward-thinking community should embrace. Unless, of course, the HOA is opposed to progress. The room erupted into murmurs. Margaret looked like she was about to spontaneously combust. "This isn't over, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low. Ethan smiled. "I didn't think it would be, Margaret. But just so we're clear, I'm moving forward with my plans. And if the HOA tries to stop me, I'll see you in court." With that, he gathered his documents and left the clubhouse, his head held high. As he walked to his car, he couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. He had found the loophole and he had used it to perfection. But Ethan knew this wasn't the end. Margaret Whitmore wasn't the type to admit defeat, and the HOA wasn't the type to let go of control. Ethan Carter's tiny home, his premium multifunctional room, was finally complete. It stood proudly in his backyard. A sleek, modern structure that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a minimalist design magazine. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, a rain barrel sat discreetly in the corner, and a small porch with potted plants added a touch of charm. It was, in a word, perfect. But Ethan knew the real test wasn't the construction. It was the HOA's reaction. He had no doubt Margaret Whitmore would find some way to object, even if it meant rewriting the bylaws on the spot. So he prepared for battle. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter. It arrived in Ethan's mailbox one sunny morning, printed on the same crisp, official paper as before. The subject line read, "Final Notice, Unapproved Structure." Ethan rolled his eyes as he read it. According to the HOA, his tiny home was still a violation, and they were giving him one last chance to rectify the situation before taking legal action. Rectify the situation? Ethan muttered. "Oh, I'll rectify something, all right." He decided to invite the HOA over for a demonstration. If they were going to fight him, they could at least do it face to face. He sent out invitations to Margaret and the board members, complete with a handwritten note that read, "Come see how innovation and sustainability can enhance our community." The day of the demonstration arrived, and Ethan was ready. He had baked cookies, sustainably sourced, of course, set up a slideshow about the benefits of tiny homes, and even printed out copies of the bylaws with his loophole highlighted in neon pink. At precisely 7 p.m., the HOA arrived. Margaret led the way, her pastel blazer as crisp as ever, followed by the board members, who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Welcome," Ethan said, greeting them with a smile. "I'm so glad you could make it. Please, come in." He led them to the backyard, where his tiny home stood in all its glory. The board members gasped, some in awe, some in horror. Margaret, however, looked like she'd just bitten into a lemon. "This," she said, gesturing to the tiny home, "is an eyesore." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "An eyesore?" "Margaret, it's 200 square feet of sustainable living." "How is that an eyesore?" "It doesn't match the aesthetic of the community," Margaret said, crossing her arms. "And what aesthetic is that?" Ethan asked. "Beige? Monotony? A complete lack of imagination." One of the board members, a man with a mustache so thin it looked like it had been drawn on with a pencil, cleared his throat. "It's actually quite nice," he said hesitantly. Margaret shot him a glare. "It's a violation of the bylaws." "Actually," Ethan said, pulling out his folder, "it's not. As I've explained before, my structure is classified as a non-permanent, multifunctional space, which means it doesn't require HOA approval. And if you'd like, I can walk you through the relevant sections of the bylaws again." Margaret's face turned red. "This is unacceptable. The HOA will not stand for this." Ethan smiled. Then take me to court, Margaret. But before you do, let me remind you that I'm a lawyer. And not just any lawyer, a lawyer who specializes in property law. So, if you want to waste your time and money on a lawsuit you're guaranteed to lose, be my guest. The room fell silent. Margaret looked like she was about to explode, but before she could say anything, one of the board members, a woman with a perm so tight it looked like it could deflect bullets, spoke up. Maybe we should let this one go, she said hesitantly. Margaret turned to her, her eyes wide. Let it go? Are you serious? The woman shrugged. He's got a point. The bylaws are on his side. And honestly, the tiny home isn't that bad. It's kind of cute. Ethan beamed. Thank you. And just think of the positive impact it could have on the community. Sustainable living, reduced carbon footprint, and a touch of creativity. What's not to love? Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but the other board members were already nodding in agreement. I think it's a great idea, the mustache man said. Me too, the woman with the perm added. Margaret looked around, realizing she was outnumbered. For the first time in her life, the queen of the neighborhood had been dethroned. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. But if this sets a precedent, I'm holding you personally responsible. Ethan smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. With that, the HOA left, their tails between their legs. Ethan stood in his backyard, watching them go, a sense of triumph washing over him. He had done it. He had outsmarted the HOA, built his tiny home, and proven that sometimes the little guy, or in this case, the tiny home, could win. As he sat on his tiny porch, sipping a cup of sustainably sourced tea, Ethan couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. His tiny home wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol of resilience, creativity, and the power of a good loophole. And as for Margaret Whitmore, well, let's just say she started avoiding Ethan's street altogether.